The rain came down like it had somewhere to be, and on a shoulder of old Route 9 outside Barstow, two men in leather lay in the gravel with a motorcycle folded around them, and the cars kept driving past. Not one of them slowed. Not one window came down. A pickup swerved wide, and a horn blared, angry, like the dying men were the inconvenience and not the storm. Both riders wore the same three-piece patch on their backs, the death's head, the rocker that read California, the small square that said the one thing the whole world thinks it understands about men who wear it. And that patch was exactly why the cars kept driving. People saw the colors and decided these two had it coming, whatever it was. But there was one person on that road who did not drive past. A woman came out of the tree line with a bedroll on her back and a garbage bag of everything she owned in one fist. 58 years old, gray hair soaked flat against her skull, wearing a man's canvas coat 3 sizes too big, and a pair of boots held together with wire. She dropped the bag in the mud, and she knelt down in the broken glass, and she took the nearest man's head in her 2 hands, and she said the only thing worth saying. "Hold on. I've got you." What none of those passing cars knew, what the woman herself did not know, was that one of the 2 men bleeding into the gravel was the national road captain of a charter that stretched from Oakland to the desert, and that within 72 hours, the name of a homeless woman nobody in that town had bothered to learn would be spoken by 300 men in a room gone completely silent. Nobody on Route 9 that afternoon had the first idea what was about to happen. This is a story about a debt, and about how long a debt can wait before it comes due. Stay with me, because we start 11 minutes before she knelt down. It started, like most of the important things do, with an ordinary sound and a bad decision made by somebody else. 11 minutes earlier, the 2 men were upright and moving at 60, and the boy in the lifted truck who drifted across the center line was 19 years old and looking at his phone. He never even felt the mirror clip. The lead bike, a black Softail with 140,000 miles on it, went sideways into the rumble strip, and the man riding it did the only thing 4 decades of riding had taught him. He laid it down instead of high-siding into the ditch, and he took the whole weight of it on his right leg and his ribs, and he skidded 40 feet through wet gravel. The second rider, younger by 23 years, tried to thread between his fallen brother and the guardrail, and he almost made it. Almost. His front wheel found the older man's spilled fuel, and he went down hard on his shoulder, and his helmet cracked against a mile marker post, and the world for him turned to a high, thin ringing, and then to nothing at all. The truck did not stop. The truck sped up. And for the next 11 minutes, the 2 of them lay there in the rain while the traffic thinned and the light went gray, and the blood from the older man's leg made a shape in the gravel that kept getting bigger. He was conscious the whole time. That was the cruel part. He lay on his back with a broken femur and 3 broken ribs, and he watched the underside of the sky, and he counted headlights, and he got to 19 sets of headlights before one of them belonged to somebody who cared whether he lived. The number was not 19 cars. He counted them later, over and over, for the rest of his life. It was 19. And then it was her. She had been walking that stretch of 9 because the shelter in Barstow closed its intake at 4, and she was not going to make 4. And walking kept her warm, and the highway shoulder was flat, and she knew every culvert on it to sleep in. She heard the crash from the tree line as a single flat crack, and then a long grinding slide, and she came out toward it without thinking about it, the way some people are simply built. And when she saw the leather and the patches, she felt the same jolt of fear the passing cars had felt. She had heard the stories, too. Everybody has. But she had spent a great many years learning that the stories people tell about a certain kind of person are usually told by people who never knelt down next to one. So she knelt down. She got the younger man's cracked helmet off the way she had been taught to do it a lifetime ago. Both hands, no twist, keeping the neck in line. And she got 2 fingers to the side of his throat and found a pulse, thready and fast. And she said his own name back to him, even though she did not know it. Said, "It's all right, son. I've got you." And then she went to the older one, because he was the one talking. He was trying to tell her to help the young one first. Even then, even bleeding out, he was giving orders about somebody else. She took his head in her hands, and she looked at the leg, and she did not flinch at it. And that was the first thing that told him she was not what she looked like. People flinch at a bone through denim. She did not. She stripped her own belt out of the loops of her 2 big trousers, and she got it around his thigh above the break, and she cinched it down until he made a sound he was ashamed of. And she said sorry, and she meant it, and she kept it tight. Then she took off the canvas coat that was the warmest thing she owned, and she pressed it into the wound, and she leaned her whole weight on it. And now she was in the rain, in a thin shirt going gray with cold. And she did not let up the pressure for 1 second. She talked to them the whole time. That is the part the younger man remembered, when he could remember anything. The voice, low and steady, telling him about nothing at all. About a dog she used to have, and the way the desert smells before rain. Keeping him in the world by the thread of her voice, while she kept his brother in it by the pressure of her hands. She did all of this before a single other car stopped. When the first car finally did stop, it was because a trucker 3 miles back had raised her on the CB from a woman who'd seen it and felt bad but hadn't stopped. And the trucker had a dash cam and a conscience, and he pulled his rig across both lanes to block the road. And he came running with a real trauma kit, because he'd been a corpsman once. And he took one look at the tourniquet and the pressure and the airway, and he said to her, "Who taught you to do that?" And she just said, "Keep your hand where mine is, and don't you dare let up." So let's stop right there. Let's freeze her, kneeling in the glass, both hands red. And let me tell you who she was before you watch what those hands had done in another life. Because you need to understand her the way the 300 men came to understand her, or the end of this will just be noise. That's the part everybody wants to skip straight to, the 300 bikes on the horizon. So let's slow down, because the arrival means nothing if you don't know the woman it was arriving for. Her name was Ruth Delgado, though the patch on the arm of a uniform she had not worn in 11 years read, Delgado R. And under it, a small enamel bar that a lot of people would recognize, and that she had stopped explaining a long time ago. Ruth was 58, and she had been sleeping rough for exactly 2 years and 4 months when she knelt down on Route 9. And before that, she had spent 30 years as a trauma nurse, 20 of them in the Army, 2 combat tours in a forward surgical unit where the helicopters came in day and night, and a nurse learned to put a hand on a stranger's artery and a voice in a stranger's ear at the same time, and to not flinch at a bone through denim, ever. Because flinching cost seconds, and seconds cost boys. That is where the hands came from. That is the whole trick of the thing that made the trucker ask, "Who taught you?" Nobody taught her. The war taught her, and 30 years of night shifts finished the lesson. Big she was, in a way that had nothing to do with size. And she was not big at all. She was a spare, gray woman you would step around in a doorway. But she had held more dying men in her 2 hands than most people have met in their lives. And every one of them she had spoken to the same way, low and steady, telling them about nothing, so they had something to hold on to that was not the pain. She had a way of making a stranger feel like the only person in the world, for as long as it took. It was not a technique, it was just Ruth. How does a woman like that end up under a culvert on Route 9? The way most of them do, which is one thing at a time. No single thing big enough to be the reason. Her husband died first, a mechanic named Sal who had waited out both her tours and married her the week she came home for good. And he went of a heart attack in the driveway of the little house they finally owned at 51, with a wrench still in his hand. Then the grief, which is a cost that comes due whether you have the money or not. Then a back injury, lifting a patient wrong on a bad night, and the surgery, and the pills they gave her for the surgery, and the 18 months she does not talk about when the pills stopped being for the back. She beat that. Understand that clearly, because the town of Barstow never bothered to learn it. She beat it, clean and hard and alone. 4 years clean by the time she knelt on Route 9. But you cannot get a nursing license back the way you get a pulse back. The board took it during the 18 months, and the process to earn it back cost money she did not have, because the house was gone by then. Sold to pay for the husband and the surgery and the lawyer. And a woman of 54 with a gap in her work history and no license and a gray braid does not get hired. Not for what she was worth. Not for anything. So she fell, one thing at a time, the way the strong ones fall, quietly, apologizing to everyone, taking up the least room she could. Now understand what that fall actually looks like. Because the word homeless is a word people use to stop themselves from having to picture it. And Ruth would want you to picture it. It was not a single terrible night with a suitcase on a curb. It was slower than that, and quieter, and meaner in the way slow things are mean. First it was the car, a 12-year-old sedan she slept in for 4 months in the lot behind a shuttered hardware store. And she kept it clean. She kept herself clean. She showered at a truck stop for $3, and she folded her 2 changes of clothes into squares the way the army had taught her to fold everything. Corners true, so that a woman living in a Buick still looked like a woman a person might hire. Then the car threw a rod she could not pay to fix, and the tow company took it for the storage debt. And that was the last thing she owned with a roof to it. She was 55 by then. And the thing nobody in Barstow ever bothered to work out was that she had done everything right, and it had not been enough. Because there is a kind of poverty that no amount of doing right can climb back out of once the license and the house and the man are all gone in the same 2 years. She learned the town the way a soldier learns terrain, which is to say, completely, and without complaint, and with an eye for cover. She knew that the shelter on D Street took intake at 4 in the afternoon and turned the bolt at 4:15, no exceptions. 31 beds for a town that needed 90, and she knew that if you were not in line by 3, you did not eat a hot meal that night. She knew which culverts under the interstate ran dry even in a storm, and which one flooded to the roof when the desert did its once-a-year impression of a river. She knew the exact hour the bakery on Main put its day-old bread in the alley bin, which was 10:40 at night, and she knew to take only what she needed and to leave the rest squared away so the next person did not have to dig. She knew which gas stations would let a gray woman use the restroom to wash and which ones had put up the sign that meant they would not. She kept a mental map of the whole town, scored by kindness and its absence. And the map, if you could have seen it, would have shamed the place. Because here is what Barstow decided about Ruth Delgado, without ever asking her a single question. The town decided she was a category. They saw the garbage bag and the wire-laced boots and the gray braid and the man's canvas coat, and they filed her under a word, and the word let them off the hook. A woman walking to the pharmacy pulled her child a half step closer as Ruth passed, and Ruth saw it. And Ruth did the thing she always did, which was to make herself smaller, so the woman would feel safe, to look at the ground, to take up the least room she could. She had put her 2 hands inside the chest of a 19-year-old soldier and held his heart still enough to sew, in a tent in a country that no longer has the name it had then. And now a mother in a parking lot flinched at her like she was weather. And Ruth did not resent it. That is the part that ought to stop you. She did not resent a single one of them, because she had spent her whole life on the other side of that flinch, in the emergency rooms at 2 in the morning, where the people who come in looking like nothing turn out to be the whole world to somebody. And she had learned young that the flinch is about the person doing it, and never about the person receiving it. So she carried the town's fear for the town, the way she had carried everything else. There were small cruelties, and she absorbed them the way she absorbed the cold. A sheriff's deputy, young, maybe 26, moved her along from a bus bench one December night when it was 34 degrees, not because she was doing anything, but because a business had called. And he was not unkind about it. He was worse than unkind. He was bored. He had done it 100 times, and she was the 101st. And he told her she could not stay there. And she said, "Yes, sir." And she picked up her bag, and she moved along. And she did not tell him that she outranked what he would ever be, that she had a chest full of ribbons in a storage unit she could no longer pay for, that men his age had once called her ma'am and meant their lives by it. She just said, "Yes, sir," because that was Ruth, and because a person who has truly been somebody has no need to say so, and the ones who need to say so were never it to begin with. But there were kindnesses, too, and Ruth kept a ledger of those that was longer than the other one, because that is the choice a certain kind of person makes about what to remember. There was a waitress at the diner off the Route 58 junction, a woman of maybe 40 named Dolores, who worked the graveyard shift. And Dolores had clocked Ruth the first week, the way one working woman clocks another. And Dolores took to leaving a cup of coffee and a plate at the far end of the counter around 2 in the morning, and charging it to nobody. And when Ruth tried to refuse it the first time, Dolores told her, without looking up from the register, "Sit down and eat. We don't waste food here." Never made it charity. Never let it look down. Just slid it across the counter the way you slide a plate to anybody. And it cost Dolores maybe $2.25 she took out of her own tips. And Ruth never forgot it. And Ruth paid it back 100 times over, in ways Dolores would not learn about for years. $2.25. Hold on to that number. It keeps coming up in this story. The small amount, the trivial cost, the tiny thing that turns out to be the whole thing. A cup of coffee that cost a tired waitress a couple of quarters. A tow bill Ruth could not cover that cost her the last roof she owned. A nursing license that hung on a sum of money most people spend on a weekend and never think about again. The whole tragedy of a good woman's fall, when you added it up, when you laid every number end to end, came to less than the price of the truck that boy was driving when he crossed the center line. And through all of it, through the car and the culverts and the deputy and the flinch in the parking lot, Ruth held on to one thing that nobody could take, and it was not a thing you could put in a garbage bag. She held on to the hour. Every single morning, no matter where she had slept, no matter how cold, she was up before the light, and she washed her face with water from a jug she kept for exactly that. And she braided the gray hair tight and clean, and she folded her bedroll into a square with true corners, and she was standing and squared away by 5 o'clock, ready for a day that had nothing in it and no one waiting on her. She kept that hour for 2 years and 4 months the way she had kept it for 30 years before, because the hour was not about a job. The hour was the last thing left that said she was still who she had decided to be a long time ago, and had never once undecided. You can take a woman's house and her license and her husband and her good name. You cannot take the hour unless she gives it to you. And Ruth Delgado never gave it to anybody. So that is the woman, 58 years old, gray braid tight and clean by 5 every morning, a kit of boiled gauze in a garbage bag, a ledger of kindnesses longer than the ledger of cruelties, by her own careful choice, hands that had held more dying strangers than a city has streets, folded now in her lap on a bus bench at 4 in the morning, waiting for a day that did not need them, in a town that had decided she was a word. That is who came out of the tree line on Route 9 in the rain. That is who knelt down in the broken glass when 19 cars had already driven past. Not a nobody who got lucky, not a category. A trauma nurse with 30 years in her hands and an oath she had never once stopped keeping, who happened, on that particular gray afternoon, to be wearing everything the world uses to decide a person is worth driving past. And here is the thing about Ruth that the town missed, and that the 300 men would not miss. In 2 years and 4 months on the street, she never once stopped being a nurse. She carried a little kit in the garbage bag, expired gauze she pulled from a clinic dumpster and boiled clean, a bottle of iodine, a needle and thread. She set a runaway kid's broken finger under the overpass and splinted it with a paint stir stick. She sat up 3 nights with an old drunk named Petey, who was seizing off the bottle, and she talked him through it the same low, steady way, about nothing, about the desert before rain. And Petey lived. And Petey would later stand up in a courtroom in a borrowed shirt and tell a judge what kind of woman they were talking about. She gave away her own blanket more times than she kept it. That was Ruth. That is who was kneeling in the glass. Now let me tell you about the 2 men she was keeping alive, because one of them mattered to a great many people. The younger one, the one with the cracked helmet and the thready pulse, was 38, and his name was Cole. And he was nobody's officer, a prospect turned member 3 years back, a diesel mechanic like Ruth's dead husband, as it happened, though none of them knew that yet. The older one, the one with the femur and the ribs and the calm, was 61, and his road name was Deacon. And Deacon was the national road captain, which, if you do not know the world, means he was the man responsible for every mile every rider in the charter put down. The man who planned the runs and rode at the front and counted his people in at the end of every day and did not sleep until the count was right. Deacon had been riding since he was 17 and wearing the patch since he was 23. And in 38 years he had buried more brothers than he could name in one sitting. To the road, to the war before the road, to the slow things that take a man's body a joint at a time. He was a hard man and a fair one, and the thing everybody said about Deacon, the thing that mattered, was that Deacon never left anybody. Not a broken-down bike at midnight, not a widow at a funeral, not a prospect getting worked over in a bar he should not have been in. In 38 years, the count had always come out right, because Deacon made it come out right. And men had died making sure of it. And Deacon carried every one of those in the set of his jaw. So when a gray homeless woman knelt in the gravel and put her belt around his leg and her coat in his wound and her voice in his ear, and did not flinch and did not let up, and told him she had him, she was doing to Deacon the exact thing Deacon had spent his whole life doing to other people. And Deacon, lying on his back counting the underside of the sky, understood that better than any man alive. He looked up at her through the rain and the gray, and he said, "What's your name?" And she said, "Ruth." And he said, "Ruth, You're one of us." He did not mean the patch. He meant the other thing, the thing under the patch, the thing the patch is supposed to mean and mostly doesn't anymore. He meant she was one of the people who does not drive past. The ambulance came at last, 11 more minutes, and the paramedics took one look at the tourniquet and the airway and the pressure dressing and the two survivors who by every rule should have been two bodies, and the senior medic, a woman herself, said the words that started everything. She said, "Whoever did this field work saved both these men. This is professional who did this." And Ruth had already stepped back into the tree line. That was the other thing about Ruth. She did the work, and she stepped back. She did not want the fuss. She did not want the questions. She did not want anybody looking too hard at a woman with no address. And mostly she was cold and wet, and it was going to be dark soon, and she had a culvert to get to before the good one flooded. So she picked up her garbage bag and her wet bedroll, and she walked off down the shoulder in a thin shirt, having given away her only coat to a stranger's leg. And the last thing Deacon saw before they loaded him was her gray braid disappearing into the rain. He did not even get to say thank you. He held on to that. He was going to fix that. Here is what Ruth believed, walking away down Route 9 in the dark and the cold. She believed that was the end of it. Two men would live who might have died, and that was a good day, better than most, and she would probably never know their names or whether they made it, and that was all right, because she had never done any of it to be known. She believed the road had already forgotten her. She was wrong. The road does not forget. That is the entire difference between the road and everybody else. And it is why this story does not end on a cold shoulder with a woman walking away. Deacon spent the next 4 days in a hospital bed in Barstow, with a steel rod in his leg and his ribs taped and a morphine drip he kept turning down because he did not trust it, given what he'd seen it do to good men. And he spent every waking hour of those 4 days doing one thing: finding her. He had a name, Ruth, and a description: gray braid, canvas coat now soaked in his own blood, and sitting in an evidence-style bag the medic had thoughtfully saved. An army bearing, hands that knew what they were doing. He put his sergeant-at-arms on it, a man named Griff, and Griff was very good at finding people who did not want to be found. And it still took him 3 of the 4 days, because Ruth had spent 2 years learning how to be invisible, and she was good at it. But everybody talks to somebody, and eventually Griff found Petey, the old drunk Ruth had talked through the seizures. And Petey, once he was sure these leather-jacketed men did not mean her harm, told them everything. Told them she was a nurse, told them she was Army, told them about the runaway kid's finger and the 3 nights of seizures and the blanket she gave away. Told them her whole name: Ruth Delgado. And when Griff walked back into that hospital room and set down what he'd learned and said the whole name out loud and said the 2 words U.S. Army and the 3rd word nurse, Deacon set down the cup of water he was holding slower than he'd set anything down in 4 days. Because Deacon had done 2 tours himself, a lifetime ago, before the patch, and he knew exactly what a combat-forward surgical nurse was, and he knew exactly what it meant that one of them was sleeping under a culvert 40 miles from where she'd kept his heart beating. And just like that, the whole shape of the thing changed. It stopped being a debt one man owed. It became something the whole road owed, and something the road was not going to be able to live with itself for owing quietly. Now here's what you have to understand before the next part will land the way it should. And I need you to actually sit with it and not skip ahead to the bikes, because the bikes are the least important thing in this whole story. What Deacon did next, he did not do out of guilt, though there was guilt. He did not do it as a grand gesture, though it became one. He did it because of a rule, the oldest rule the road has, older than any charter. The rule that says, you do not leave anybody. And the corollary, that nobody ever writes down, but every real one lives by, which is that a debt of kindness is the only debt that compounds. It does not shrink with time. It grows. A kindness done to you when you were down and could give nothing back, and the other person could not even collect. That is the heaviest debt there is. And Deacon had spent his whole life making other people's count come out right. And now, his own count was one short. And her name was Ruth. And she was sleeping in a culvert. And Deacon was not going to be able to close his eyes at night until that was fixed. That is not charity. Charity looks down. This looked across. So on the 5th day, the day they let him out of the hospital in a wheelchair he hated, Deacon made 2 phone calls. The first was to Cole, the younger man, who had walked out of the hospital on day 2 with a concussion and a bad shoulder, and a debt of his own he was already half out of his mind trying to figure out how to pay. Cole answered in the first ring. Deacon said 4 words. We're going to find her. Cole said he was already looking. The second call Deacon made was to the charter, all of it, every officer and every chapter from Oakland down to the desert line. And what he told them was not a request. Deacon did not make requests. That was not his office. He told them there was going to be a run. He told them the date and the place. He told them it was for one of ours. And when the officer on the other end asked which brother, Deacon said her name. Ruth Delgado. And then he told the story, the whole thing, the rain and the 19 cars and the belt and the coat and the voice about nothing and the gray braid walking away into the dark in a thin shirt in the cold. He told it plain, no heat in it, because a thing that true does not need heat. And every man he told it to told 3 more. And that is how, over the next 2 weeks, a story about a homeless woman who did not drive past traveled up and down the length of California, from one hard man to the next. And every one of them went quiet the same way when they got to the part about the coat. But finding Ruth again, the second time, was harder than the first, because now the weather had turned and the culverts had flooded, and Ruth had moved, the way she always moved, quiet, apologizing to no one because there was no one to apologize to, taking up the least room she could. Cole found her in the end, and how he found her is the part I want you to hold on to, because it closes the first loop. He found her the same way she found him. He was driving the shoulder of Route 9 in the rain at dusk, going slow, checking every culvert, when he saw a shape kneeling in the gravel up ahead, a gray shape in a too big coat, and his heart went into his throat until he got close enough to see it was not her. It was Ruth kneeling over somebody else, over Petey, the old drunk, who had gone down in the cold with his heart doing something bad. And Ruth had her hands on his chest and her voice in his ear, low and steady, about nothing at all. Cole got out of the truck, and he ran, and he got down in the gravel next to her, and Ruth did not even look up. She just said, "Keep your hand where mine is, and don't you dare let up." The same words she'd said to the trucker. She did not recognize Cole at all. He'd been unconscious the whole time she'd known him. But Cole recognized her. And Cole, who had a phone and a signal and a brotherhood, called it in. And this time, when the ambulance came, it did not take Petey away from a stranger who stepped back into the trees. This time, Cole put his own jacket, his cut, the most sacred thing a man in that world owns. He took it off, and he put it around Ruth's shoulders in the rain. And he said, "Ma'am, my name is Cole. You kept me alive on this road 3 weeks ago, and I have been looking for you every single day since. And you are not sleeping outside tonight, or any other night, for the rest of your life." And Ruth, who had not cried when her husband died in the driveway, who had not cried when the board took her license, who had not cried through 2 combat tours or 2 years under a culvert, Ruth looked at this young man kneeling in the gravel, holding out everything he had, and she put her red hands over her face. They did not take her to a shelter. They took her to Deacon's house, which was Deacon's wife's house too, a woman named Carol, who had been married to the road for 31 years and had made a lot of coffee for a lot of broken people. And Carol drew Ruth a hot bath and put out clean clothes and food. And Ruth kept trying to leave, kept saying she couldn't, kept apologizing, taking up the least room she could. And Deacon, in his wheelchair he hated, wheeled himself in front of the door so she could not get past without going through him. And he said, "Ruth, sit down." And she sat. And then Deacon told her about the run. He told her that in 9 days, 300 men were going to ride into Barstow. And she said, "What for?" And he told her, "For you." And Ruth, who did not understand yet, who thought maybe it was a fundraiser or a benefit, some kindness she could accept a small piece of and then slip away from, Ruth said she didn't want any fuss. She'd only done what anybody would do. And Deacon looked at her for a long moment, and then he said the truest thing in this whole story. He said, "Ruth, 19 cars drove past me." He said, "I counted them, and not one of them was anybody. And you were the only body on that whole road who was anybody. And you did it in a thin shirt, and you gave me your coat, and you walked away in the cold, and you never even told me your name." He said, "That's not nothing, Ruth. That's the only thing." Now, I told you 300 men were coming, and I want to slow down before they get here, because I know that's the part you've been waiting for, the horizon full of bikes, and I promise you it's coming. But if I let you skip to it, you'll think it's about the noise and the numbers, and it is not about the noise. It is about what the noise was for. So bear with me one more minute. In the 9 days before the run, the road did quiet, careful work, the kind nobody films. Griff, the sergeant-at-arms, who could find anybody, found Ruth's old nursing board file, and found the lawyer who'd taken her house, and found the exact dollar figure it would cost to petition the state to reinstate a license that had been pulled for a substance issue 4 clean years in the past. The number was smaller than you'd think, for a thing that had cost a woman her whole life. It was the kind of trivial number that ruins people because they simply do not have it. And the road had it before lunch. But money was the easy part. The hard part was the thing money cannot buy, which is standing and character and proof. And for that, they did not send lawyers. They sent men. And they sent the truth. They got the senior paramedic who'd said this is professional to write it down. They got the trucker, the old corpsman, to write down what he saw. They got Petey, sober now, and staying sober because Ruth was going to be around to make sure of it, to write down 3 nights of seizures. They got a stack of sworn statements 2 inches thick from strangers Ruth had helped and never billed and never mentioned. A whole invisible ledger of a woman who had never once stopped being a nurse, even when the state said she wasn't one. And on the morning of the run, they brought all of it, and Ruth, cleaned up and rested and wearing clothes that fit for the first time in years, to a hall in Barstow big enough to hold what was coming. They came from the north first. You heard them before you saw them. And if you have never heard 300 bikes coming down a desert highway from 10 miles out, I cannot fully explain it to you. But the closest thing is weather. A low, rolling thunder that does not stop, that just builds and builds until the ground under your boots is humming with it, until the windows in the hall buzz in their frames. Ruth stood at the window and watched the horizon, and the horizon turned into a line, and the line turned into a river of chrome and black leather that took 11 minutes to pass a single point. 11 minutes. The same number of minutes the two of them had once lain in the gravel while 19 cars drove past, and Deacon at the front on the back of Griff's bike because his own leg wouldn't let him ride yet, and every single man of them there for one gray woman who had told two of them, "Hold on, I've got you." They filled the hall, and they spilled out into the lot, and they stood, 300 of them. Hard men, old men and young men, veterans, a lot of them, men the world crosses the street to avoid, and they went quiet. 300 men. Quiet. You could hear the wind, and Deacon, standing now on a cane, because he was not going to say this sitting down, told them the story one more time, out loud, the whole thing, so that every man who'd only heard it second-hand could hear it from the man it happened to. And when he got to the part about the coat, 300 men who do not cry got something in their eyes, all at once, the way a field of wheat all leans when the wind crosses it. And then Deacon called Ruth up to the front, and she came, small and gray and terrified of the fuss, and Deacon took off his own cut, his colors, 38 years of road on it, and he did not put it on her, because a person earns that a different way, and Ruth would have been the first to say so. Instead, he held up the canvas coat, her coat, the one she'd pressed into his leg, cleaned now, the blood stain faded to a shadow, and he'd had something stitched over the breast, small, a red cross inside a circle, and under it 2 words, "Our nurse." And he put her own coat back on her shoulders, from behind, the way you'd help any elder into a coat. And then he told her the rest. He told her about the license, the petition already filed, the 2 inches of statements, the money already handled, the small apartment already leased 3 blocks from the VA clinic that had already agreed to take her on the day her license cleared, because a combat nurse with her hands does not stay unemployed 1 hour longer than the paperwork takes. He told her Petey had a room in the same building, and a job sweeping up, and 91 days sober because of her. He told her the runaway kid whose finger she'd splinted had been found and was safe. He told her that from that day forward, there was not one member of that charter, 300 men and their families, who would ever let Ruth Delgado want for anything. Not a ride, not a meal, not a roof, not company on a bad night, ever again, for the rest of her life. Because that is what the patch is supposed to mean. And today, for once, it meant exactly that. Ruth stood there in her own coat with her own name stitched on it, and she looked out at 300 silent men, and she did the only thing a person like that can do. She said, "Thank you." Quiet. And then she said, "But I only did what anybody would do." And an old veteran near the front, a man missing part of one hand, called out, "No, ma'am," he said. 19 cars proved that wrong. And the whole hall said it back to her, low, 300 voices. That's the only thing. Ruth Delgado got her license back 4 months later. The state, faced with 2 inches of sworn truth and 4 clean years, and a room full of people who would not go away, did the right thing. which the state does sometimes when enough decent people make it too embarrassing to do otherwise. She went to work at the VA clinic 3 blocks from her apartment, and she was very good at it, the way she had always been very good at it, low and steady, making every frightened old veteran on that table feel like the only person in the world for as long as it took. She worked there 9 more years. She never did move to a bigger place. Petey stayed sober until the day he died 4 years on, of an old liver and a good heart. And Ruth held his hand at the end and talked to him about nothing, about the desert before rain. Deacon healed and rode again, and every year on the anniversary of the crash, the exact day, a smaller group, just the 2 charters closest, would ride quiet to Ruth's little apartment, and she would make them all coffee in a kitchen too small to hold them, and they would spill out onto the walkway, and it was the best day of her year, every year, and she said so. Deacon rode until he was 69, and then his body took the road away from him a joint at a time the way it does, and he died at 71 in his own bed, with Carol's hand in his, and Ruth's other hand on the pulse at his throat. Because, of course, it was Ruth they called, and she talked him out of the world the same low, steady way she'd talked 2 men into staying in it on a wet shoulder years before. About nothing. About the desert before rain. 300 men rode at his funeral. And walking at the front of the procession, on foot, because she said Deacon walked her in and she'd walk him out, was a gray nurse in an old canvas coat with a faded shadow of a stain over the heart, and 2 words stitched above it. Ruth kept that coat the rest of her life, and she never once had to use it for what it was made for again. But she never gave it away either, the woman who gave away every blanket she ever owned. Because some things you keep not because you need them, but because of what they cost, and who paid, and what got paid back. So think back, now, to where this started. A wet road, a folded motorcycle, 2 men bleeding in the gravel, and 19 cars driving past. It looked, in that first moment, like the whole world had already decided those men were nothing, and that gray woman was nobody. 3 throwaway lives on a shoulder nobody would remember. That's how it looked. But here's the thing about the people the world writes off. The homeless woman, the old biker, the drunk, the ones you'd step around in a doorway. Sometimes the throwaway person kneeling in the glass is the only one on the whole road who still remembers the oldest rule there is. You do not drive past. You do not leave anybody. And a kindness done when you had nothing to give and could never collect is the one debt in this world that always, always comes due, with interest, in the fullness of time, whether it takes an hour or takes a lifetime. 19 cars saw a nobody in the gravel. What they should have seen was the only somebody for miles, a woman who'd carried more dying strangers home than a city has streets, doing the one thing she'd never stopped knowing how to do. Hold on. I've got you. The crash isn't really the story, and neither is the 300 bikes, though I know that's the picture on the thumbnail. The story is the 11 minutes she knelt in the cold in a thin shirt for a stranger who could give her nothing, and how the road remembered it when she'd already forgotten it herself. So let me ask you something, and I read every single answer, I mean that. When Ruth walked away down that shoulder in the rain, giving away her only coat, certain the world had already forgotten her, what would you have done if you'd been the 20th car? would you have stopped? If you're new here, this is the kind of story we tell. The quiet ones, the underestimated ones, the debts that wait years and come due when you least expect them and need them most. Stick around, subscribe if these are your people, and I think they are, because you made it all the way to the end of a story about a homeless nurse and 300 bikers. And that tells me everything about who you are. There are 2 more stories waiting for you right on the screen, cut from the same cloth as this one. Thank you for caring enough to sit with the whole thing. That, more than anything, is the only thing.